Lonely billionaire accepts a blind date on vacation and freezes when he sees who it is. When Caleb Whitmore realized the dinner invitation wasn't meant for business, he almost laughed and walked away. He had spent 20 years choosing control over connection, and tonight was supposed to pass quietly, without consequence. But something about being alone, a day early, with no meetings and no excuses, made the choice feel heavier than it should have. The resort lobby was warm and crowded, full of voices that didn't belong to him. Caleb stood still with his suitcase beside him, aware that for the first time in years, no one needed anything from him. No calls, no urgency, no role to play. Time felt exposed, and so did he. The sign near the restaurant read, "Blind Date Dinner Tonight," written like a suggestion instead of a risk. Caleb didn't want romance, and he didn't expect connection. He just didn't want to eat alone again. So he wrote his name down, convincing himself it didn't mean anything. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything. Hours later, seated at a quiet table, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in a boardroom. The air smelled like citrus and salt, laughter echoing nearby. When footsteps stopped in front of him, he looked up, expecting a stranger. Recognition hit before logic could catch up. Her face carried time, but not distance. A memory he had never touched now standing right there. As she took the empty seat, every rule that usually kept him safe slipped away. Some doors don't knock before opening, and once they do, there's no pretending you didn't hear them. Caleb Whitmore wasn't known for getting things wrong, especially not timing. At 42, he had built a company valued in the billions by predicting problems before they appeared and solving them fast. His days were measured in decisions, numbers, and responsibility, not feelings or pauses. People admired his discipline, his focus, his ability to stay calm when others broke. What no one ever talked about was how quiet his life became when the work stopped. This trip to the Caribbean wasn't his idea, and definitely wasn't emotional. A group of executives had insisted he needed distance to think clearly, to recharge before the next expansion deal. They called it strategy, not rest, and that made it easier for Caleb to agree. But a scheduling error placed him at the resort a full day before everyone else arrived. Suddenly, the buffer of business disappeared, leaving him alone with himself. With unstable cell service and no urgent emails loading properly, Caleb felt a strange unease. He tried to scroll through messages, then gave up when the screen froze again. There was nothing demanding his attention. No fire to put out. No decision waiting on his signature. The absence of pressure should have felt like relief, but instead it made him restless. He realized how much his identity depended on being needed. While Caleb wandered the resort trying to kill time, Lauren Hale arrived with laughter and movement around her. She and her friends had planned this trip for months, syncing schedules across states and careers. Lauren had insisted it be about rest, not networking, not productivity, not fixing anyone else's problems. At 39, she'd spent years building her clothing brand with patience and stubborn belief. This trip marked the first time she'd stepped away without guilt. Lauren moved through the lobby with an ease that came from knowing who she was. Her success wasn't loud, and neither was her confidence, but both were real. Her friends teased her about dating, about always being the strong one, the one who didn't need help. She smiled, but deep down she knew they weren't entirely wrong. She had learned how to survive alone, and sometimes that scared her. When the group noticed the blind date dinner sign, it started as a joke. They laughed, dared each other, made comments about fate and vacation romance. Lauren didn't feel excited or anxious, just curious in a quiet, cautious way. She signed her name because it felt like choosing experience over avoidance. Not love, not hope, just presence. Back at his table, Caleb told himself the same thing in different words. This dinner wasn't about connection. It was about doing something unfamiliar without consequence. He didn't know Lauren would be the one walking toward him, and if he had, he might have left. Because there were parts of his past he never revisited, not out of pain, but out of habit. And that habit was about to be challenged in a way he couldn't control. As the room filled with voices and movement, both of them carried separate lives toward the same moment. Years of choices, distance, and unspoken assumptions lined up without asking permission. Neither of them understood yet why this meeting mattered so much. They only felt the tension of something unfinished pressing quietly between them. And that pressure was just beginning to take shape. Lauren reached the table with a polite smile already prepared, the kind people use when they expect a stranger. She slid into the chair across from Caleb, placing her napkin on her lap like she'd done it 1,000 times. For half a second, her eyes were relaxed and casual, and then something in her expression shifted. It wasn't shock like in the movies. It was recognition that landed quietly and still hit hard. Caleb saw it the same instant he felt it, like two memories waking up at once. He didn't stand, even though manners told him to, because his body forgot the next step. Caleb had handled boardroom ambushes and billion-dollar negotiations without breaking eye contact. But this was different because it wasn't a fight. It was a mirror held up to a version of himself he'd buried. Lauren wasn't someone he had dated or lost. She was someone he had never allowed himself to approach. And that made the moment feel raw in a way he couldn't prepare for. Lauren cleared her throat and said his name carefully, like she wanted to make sure it was real. Caleb answered with a small nod, still trying to place her inside the present instead of the past. He remembered the university yearbook, the hallway noise, the distance between their worlds. She had been the bright center of a circle he never entered, and he had been the quiet guy people didn't notice. Now they were sitting across from each other, both older, both changed, both suddenly aware of what time does. The waiter came by with water and a cheerful tone, and the normality of it helped them breathe again. Lauren offered a small laugh, not flirtatious, just human, like she was admitting the weirdness out loud without saying it. Caleb followed her lead and asked the simplest question he could find, how long she'd been on the island. She answered, then asked the same, and the conversation took one cautious step forward. It was awkward, but it was also safe enough to continue. Lauren mentioned she was traveling with friends and gestured lightly to the room, where other tables were full of people. She didn't point dramatically. She just let him know she wasn't alone here, that this wasn't some private setup. Caleb nodded and felt a strange relief, not because he didn't want intimacy, but because he needed space to adjust. He admitted he was there early because of a scheduling mistake, and Lauren smiled like she understood the kind of person that happens to. In that small exchange, the tension softened, not gone, just manageable. They started sharing details that felt neutral but slowly turned warm, like the surface of a pool before you realize it's comfortable. Lauren talked about running a clothing brand and how the business never really leaves your head, even on vacation. Caleb didn't brag about his company. He just said he worked too much and didn't know how to stop. Lauren didn't judge him for it, and he noticed that immediately, because most people either praise him or resent him. Her calm acceptance made him feel less like a headline and more like a person. Then Lauren said something small that opened a door in his chest, almost by accident. She mentioned the university, the campus energy, the late-night food spots, the professors everyone feared. Caleb laughed for real, surprised at himself, because he hadn't thought about those years in a long time. He added a detail she didn't expect, and she looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. It wasn't romance yet. It was recognition, the slow kind that feels like coming back to something honest. By the time the appetizers arrived, they were no longer two strangers trapped in an event they regretted signing up for. They were two adults realizing they had shared a place in time without ever sharing a moment. The air between them felt charged but gentle, like possibility that didn't demand anything right away. Caleb told himself it was just a good conversation and nothing more, but his voice didn't fully convince him. And when Lauren smiled and said, "This is kind of surreal," he knew the night was already changing direction. As the dinner moved forward, both of them became aware of a quiet pressure settling between their words, something neither wanted to name yet. The recognition they shared hadn't brought excitement so much as vulnerability, the kind that makes people careful with every sentence. Caleb noticed how easily he slipped into listening mode, not to impress, but to understand, and that alone felt unfamiliar. Lauren, on the other hand, felt an old instinct rise, the one that told her to stay composed and emotionally self-sufficient. Neither realized yet that this instinct, while protective, was also isolating. When the main course arrived, the restaurant noise faded into the background, replaced by a focused stillness at their table. Lauren spoke about her friends, about how rare it was for all of them to slow down at the same time, and how much planning it took. Caleb responded with small comments at first, then longer ones, sharing how little room his life had left for spontaneity. He didn't dramatize it or ask for sympathy, but the honesty landed heavier than he expected. Lauren could hear the fatigue under his calm tone, and it stayed with her. Caleb felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with status or wealth and everything to do with being seen without armor. He realized he was sitting across from someone who didn't know his net worth and hadn't Googled him beforehand. That absence of expectation created a space where he didn't need to perform or defend himself. At the same time, it stirred a fear he hadn't felt in years, the fear of emotional misalignment. Letting someone see the real pace of his life meant admitting how lonely it had become. Lauren carried her own quiet weight into the conversation, even as she kept her voice steady and warm. She mentioned the pressure of being the dependable one in every room, the person others leaned on without checking in. Caleb noticed how casually she said it, like she'd rehearsed those words in her head many times before. He recognized the pattern immediately, because it mirrored his own in a different form. Strength, he realized, had cost both of them more than they liked to admit. At one point, the conversation stalled, not from boredom, but from hesitation. There was a shared sense that something deeper was waiting just beneath the surface, and neither knew how to approach it safely. Lauren took a sip of water and looked around the room, grounding herself in the present. Caleb followed her gaze and felt grateful for the pause, even as he sensed the tension growing. This wasn't discomfort from disinterest. It was discomfort from care. When Lauren finally spoke again, her tone softened, and she admitted she hadn't planned on meeting anyone meaningful that night. She explained that the dinner was supposed to be light, almost silly, something to laugh about later with her friends. Caleb nodded and confessed he'd signed up for the same reason, to avoid another quiet meal alone. They both laughed gently at the coincidence, but the laughter didn't erase the weight of the moment. It only made it clearer that neither of them was as detached as they'd hoped. As dessert menus arrived, Caleb felt a sudden awareness of time slipping forward. He wondered what would happen when the dinner ended and the structure holding them together dissolved. Lauren sensed that same uncertainty and felt a familiar instinct telling her to retreat before things became complicated. Neither of them said it out loud, but both felt the approach of a moment that would require a choice, and that choice, whatever it was, would test how much vulnerability they were willing to allow. By the time the plates were cleared, the space between them felt both fragile and meaningful. Caleb knew that the hardest part of the night wasn't behind them. It was waiting just ahead. Lauren felt the same quiet warning in her chest, the one that usually told her to protect her independence. This time, though, she wasn't sure that walking away untouched would feel like strength, and as they stood to leave the table, neither realized how alone one of them would soon feel. The next morning unfolded more quietly than either of them expected, as if the island itself had decided to slow things down. Caleb walked along the beach earlier than usual, not to exercise or think through problems, but because sleep hadn't come easily. His mind kept replaying the dinner, not in fragments, but as a whole feeling he couldn't shake. He told himself it was just nostalgia, just familiarity mixed with good timing. Still, his steps carried him forward with a purpose he didn't name. Lauren had come to the beach for a different reason, hoping the water would clear her head. She wasn't searching for Caleb, and she wasn't avoiding him either, which confused her more than she liked. The night before had felt safe, and safety sometimes made her uneasy because it asked something back. She had learned to move through life without depending too much on anyone. Yet the conversation with Caleb had stirred something she hadn't planned on revisiting. When they noticed each other near the shoreline, there was no dramatic pause or awkward wave. They simply acknowledged each other with small smiles, like people who already shared a rhythm. Caleb asked if she wanted to walk, and Lauren agreed without weighing the choice too carefully. The ocean was calm, the air warm, and the morning light softened everything it touched. For a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to something manageable. As they walked, the conversation picked up where it had left off, only quieter and more honest. Lauren talked about her brand and how success didn't protect her from doubt the way people assumed. Caleb listened closely, recognizing the familiar tension between achievement and exhaustion. He shared how his company demanded constant vigilance, how stepping away felt like tempting collapse. Neither offered solutions, which made the exchange feel genuine instead of transactional. Lauren stopped near the waterline and mentioned how she used swimming to reset her thoughts. She kicked off her sandals and stepped into the ocean without ceremony, letting the water rise slowly. Caleb watched her for a moment, then sat on the sand, content to observe rather than follow. The distance between them wasn't emotional, it was physical, and it felt safe that way. He assumed the moment would stay simple. A few minutes passed before Caleb noticed something change in her movements. Lauren wasn't drifting casually anymore. Her strokes had grown uneven and strained. She lifted one arm and tried to signal, but the gesture lacked clarity. At first, he thought she was joking, until the tension in her posture became undeniable. His body reacted before his thoughts could slow him down. Caleb stood and ran toward the water without shouting or scanning for help. He didn't think about cameras, pride, or risk. He thought about getting to her. The current pulled harder than it looked, but adrenaline kept him moving forward. Lauren tried to stay afloat, panic flashing briefly across her face before she forced herself to stay calm. In that instant, both of them felt how fragile independence could be. When Caleb reached her and pulled her back toward shallower water, there was no dramatic collapse or crowd. They reached the sand breathless, sitting in silence while the ocean continued as if nothing had happened. Lauren finally spoke, her voice steady but shaken, and thanked him for not hesitating. Caleb nodded, unsure what to say, aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. And as the morning settled again, both realized this was no longer just a coincidence worth remembering. Caleb stayed close without hovering, giving Lauren space to breathe while still making it clear she wasn't alone. He offered his towel, then sat a few feet away so she could regain control without feeling watched. Lauren tried to laugh it off, but her hands shook when she reached for her water bottle. Caleb didn't correct her or tease her, because he could tell the fear had been real. When she finally looked up, her eyes carried a quiet gratitude that felt heavier than any thank you. Lauren admitted she'd gotten a cramp so sudden it stole her confidence in 1 second. She said she'd been strong her whole life, and it scared her how fast her body reminded her she wasn't invincible. Caleb nodded and told her he understood that feeling, not from cramps, but from the way life can flip your sense of safety without warning. He didn't talk about himself much, but he let her see the part of him that knew fear from the inside. That honesty made Lauren exhale, like she'd been holding her breath for years. They walked back toward the resort slowly, and Caleb adjusted his pace to match hers, even when she insisted she was fine. Lauren's friends spotted them from a distance and rushed over with concern, their voices overlapping in panic and relief. Caleb introduced himself simply, without titles, without the polished confidence people expected from him. He answered their questions calmly and reassured them that Lauren was okay, and he meant it. Even as the friends surrounded her, Caleb noticed how quickly Lauren tried to take care of everyone else's emotions first. Later, Caleb asked the resort staff to send an on-call medic to check Lauren, not because she was in danger, but because she deserved reassurance. Lauren tried to refuse at first, saying she didn't want to make a scene or waste anyone's time. Caleb kept his tone gentle and told her it wasn't a scene, it was care, and care didn't need to be earned. The medic confirmed she was fine, but also reminded her that dehydration and stress make cramps more likely, and Lauren went quiet at the word stress. Caleb saw that reaction and realized the ocean wasn't the only thing pulling at her. That afternoon, Caleb canceled a conference call he could have taken from the balcony, and the decision surprised even him. He told himself it was just one call, that the world wouldn't collapse if he skipped it, but the truth was, he didn't want to disappear into work again. Lauren sat with her friends under an umbrella, laughing again, yet her laughter had an edge of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Caleb didn't push his way into the group, but he stayed nearby, reading, present, available. It was a new kind of effort for him, the effort of staying emotionally reachable. When Lauren finally walked over and sat beside him, she didn't talk about the water right away. She asked him why he reacted so fast, why he didn't hesitate, why he didn't wait for the lifeguard like most people would. Caleb stared at the horizon for a moment and admitted he didn't think. He just moved, and he didn't fully know why. Then he said something simpler and truer, that he couldn't stand the idea of watching someone struggle alone when he had the ability to help. Lauren swallowed hard because the sentence landed in a place she usually kept protected. Over the next days, Caleb's kindness showed up in quiet choices, not grand gestures. He brought Lauren coffee the way she liked it after hearing her mention it once, and he remembered without making a big deal out of it. He suggested short walks instead of intense activities, letting her set the pace while still keeping her engaged with the world. He listened when she spoke about business pressure and family expectations, and he didn't interrupt with solutions or comparisons. For Lauren, that kind of steady attention felt like a form of healing she hadn't expected to find on a vacation. But even as the bond grew, Caleb felt a new tension forming under his calm, because he knew his real life would return the moment his group arrived. He didn't want to promise anything he couldn't protect, and he didn't want to become another person who made Lauren feel safe for a week and then vanished. Lauren sensed that hesitation too, and part of her wanted to step back before she got attached to something temporary. They didn't say it out loud, but the question started to hover between them like humidity before a storm. And as the sun dropped over the water, Caleb realized the hardest choice might not be saving her in the ocean, but deciding how to show up after the vacation ended. As the days passed, Caleb and Lauren settled into a rhythm that felt intentional without being declared. They didn't label what they were doing or rush to define it, which made every moment feel more honest. Mornings started with quiet coffee and shared looks that said more than words. Caleb found himself staying present instead of checking his phone, something he rarely managed even with effort. Lauren noticed the change and felt a soft safety growing where guarded independence used to live. They talked about childhood memories in pieces, not dramatic confessions, but small truths that shaped who they became. Lauren shared how being relied on early in life taught her to stay composed even when she needed support herself. Caleb admitted he learned to be valuable by being useful, not vulnerable, and that lesson followed him into adulthood. Neither tried to fix the other, which made the space between them feel balanced. It was the first time both felt seen without being analyzed. One afternoon, they sat under a shaded terrace while a brief tropical rain passed through. The rain didn't interrupt their conversation, it softened it, like background permission to slow down. Lauren spoke about the pressure of being admired for strength while quietly craving rest. Caleb listened closely, realizing how rarely people trusted him with emotional truth instead of expectations. He didn't interrupt, didn't reassure too quickly, and that patience mattered more than any promise. Caleb shared how his success brought freedom and isolation in equal measure, something few people believed when they heard his numbers. He explained that loneliness didn't arrive all at once but accumulated quietly in skipped moments and delayed connections. Lauren didn't react with pity or surprise, which allowed him to continue without defense. She simply acknowledged that success often hides exhaustion better than it cures it. That understanding settled between them like shared ground. Their connection deepened not through dramatic events, but through consistent presence. Caleb walked Lauren back to her room each night without expectation, never pushing for more than she offered. Lauren appreciated that restraint more than grand gestures because it gave her control without distance. She found herself opening up more because nothing was being demanded of her. That balance built trust faster than attraction ever could. At dinner one evening, Lauren reached for her glass and hesitated, her hand pausing just long enough for Caleb to notice. He didn't call attention to it, but he gently shifted the glass closer, a quiet act of care. Lauren smiled, not because she needed help, but because someone noticed without making her feel fragile. That small moment carried more weight than compliments or declarations. It felt like partnership forming before romance entered the picture. Caleb realized he was investing emotionally in a way he hadn't allowed himself in years. He didn't feel distracted or reckless. He felt grounded and clear. The fear wasn't about losing control, but about losing the connection once reality returned. Lauren sensed that awareness and felt her own tension rise, knowing how temporary vacations could be. Neither wanted to speak the ending into existence. As the sun set over the water that evening, they sat in silence, watching light fade without filling the space. Caleb wondered whether connection like this could survive outside the quiet bubble they'd found. Lauren wondered if she was strong enough to let it continue beyond safety. Neither voiced the question, but both felt it waiting, and that unspoken uncertainty marked the point where their bond shifted from comfort into commitment. Reality began to press in slowly, not as a shock, but as a series of reminders that the world outside the resort still existed. Caleb's phone started receiving messages again as the signal improved, each notification pulling gently at his attention. He didn't answer them right away, but Lauren noticed the shift in his posture, the way responsibility returned to his shoulders. She understood that look, because she wore a version of it every day in her own life. The difference was that now, they were both aware of what was being asked of them. When Caleb's group of executives finally arrived, the energy around him changed immediately. Conversations turned sharper, schedules reappeared, and decisions demanded urgency again. Lauren watched from a distance as people greeted him with respect and expectation, and she saw how easily he stepped back into that role. It didn't make her feel small, but it did remind her that his world moved fast and rarely waited. She wondered quietly where someone like her fit into that pace. The question didn't hurt yet, but it carried weight. Lauren's friends noticed the shift too, and pulled her aside with concern masked as casual curiosity. They asked who Caleb really was, what his intentions might be, and whether she was being careful enough. Lauren defended him without exaggeration, explaining how present and thoughtful he'd been, how safe she felt around him. Still, the questions planted seeds of doubt she'd worked hard not to grow. Independence had always protected her, and now it was whispering again. She didn't want fear to make decisions for her, but she also didn't want to ignore reality. Caleb struggled in his own way, caught between the calm he'd found and the life that demanded his return. He found himself shortening meetings so he could see Lauren afterward, something his colleagues noticed but didn't comment on. Part of him worried he was being irresponsible. Another part worried he was finally being honest. He'd spent years postponing connection in the name of stability, only to realize how unstable that choice had made him feel. The internal conflict followed him everywhere. One evening, the tension finally surfaced during a quiet walk near the water. Lauren admitted she could feel the distance growing, even when they were standing close. Caleb didn't deny it or offer excuses, which surprised her. He explained that he didn't want to disappear on her once the vacation ended, but he didn't know how to promise something he hadn't yet figured out. The honesty hurt a little, but it also felt respectful. They both recognized the moment as a crossroads. Lauren shared her own fear, not of losing him, but of losing herself by adjusting too much to someone else's life. She explained how hard she'd worked to build a world that didn't depend on anyone staying. Caleb listened without interrupting, understanding that this wasn't rejection, but self-preservation. For the first time, they acknowledged that connection didn't automatically solve complexity. Sometimes it revealed it, and that revelation asked for patience instead of answers. External pressure